Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating historical mystery. We're going to explore exactly how a deeply fragmented island, a place that was constantly battered by relentless invasions and chopped up into these fiercely competitive tribal kingdoms, somehow managed to forge a unified name and an unshakable identity that still completely dominates the globe today. That's right, we are uncovering the origins of England.
Okay, let's dive into this with a really massive historical paradox that basically sits right at the heart of our story today. If you know even a little bit about this era, you know that it was the Saxon kingdom of Wessex that ultimately saved the country from total Viking annihilation. The Saxons were the very last ones standing. So think about it. If the Saxons were the great heroes and the ultimate victors, why on earth isn't the country called Saxonland? Why do we speak English rather than, Saxonish? Well, to solve the mystery of King Alfred's genius political choices, we first need to rewind the clock a bit.
Section 1. The Mystery of the Name.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that long before the Anglo-Saxons even set foot on its shores, geography was already shaping this island's identity. The ancient Greeks actually refer to the largest island here as Albion. This likely tied into the Latin albus, meaning white, which was a direct nod to those iconic towering white cliffs of Dover that are perfectly visible from mainland Europe. Then, the Romans arrive in the 1st century CE, and they popularize a totally different term, Britannia, which was derived from earlier Greek geographic terms. So for literally centuries, the land was known by names handed to it by Mediterranean empires.
Moving on to Section 2. Albion to Anglo-Saxons.
So everything changed when the mighty Roman Empire began to crumble, creating this massive, frankly terrifying power vacuum. Looking at the timeline really puts the sheer turbulence of the island into perspective. First, you have the Celts arriving around 500 BCE, bringing iron tools and laying down these deep cultural roots. Then, the Romans conquered the territory in the 1st century CE, building roads, towns, the whole shebang. But by the 5th century, the Roman legions pull out to go defend their collapsing homeland. The native Britons are suddenly left defenseless. So what do? They hire Germanic mercenaries from mainland Europe to protect them. But these mercenaries, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, well, they don't just protect the land, they take it for themselves, establishing their own fiercely competing kingdoms.
But here is a critical piece of the puzzle. Before England ever existed as a political reality, it actually existed as a literary concept. Back in the 8th century, an incredibly influential monk and historian named Bede wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Even though the land was chopped up into all these different warring kingdoms at the time, Bede's immensely popular book conceptually grouped these Germanic settlers together as one unified English people. He essentially planted a really powerful seed in the minds of his readers.
And who exactly were these English that Bede was writing about? The name itself comes from the Angles, one of the most dominant of the migrating Germanic tribes. They originally hailed from the Angel Peninsula in what is today northern Germany. The name might actually derive from a Germanic root for narrow, referring to the shape of their homeland's waterways, or perhaps even a word meaning hook, like a fishing hook. Whatever the origin, the Angles settled vast, prosperous regions of the island, creating massive kingdoms like East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria.
Section 3. The Great Viking Threat.
Of course, every great historical thriller needs a terrifying antagonist, right? And for the Anglo-Saxons, this threat arrives straight from the sea, forcing these divided kingdoms into a desperate corner. Starting in the late 8th century, the Vikings didn't just come to raid, they came to conquer. The sheer devastation they brought was catastrophic for the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings systematically wiped out almost all the established kingdoms. The great Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, conquered. East Anglia, fallen. That powerhouse kingdom of Mercia, partitioned, with the eastern half falling under Viking rule, an area that became known as the Danelaw.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of the conflict. By the year 878 AD, literally every single Anglo-Saxon kingdom had been crushed, except for one, the Saxon kingdom of Wessex down in the south. Driven out into the swamps, a young king named Alfred, who we'd later know as Alfred the Great, absolutely refused to surrender. He rallied his forces and managed to pull off a miraculous, decisive victory against the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Alfred saved the Anglo-Saxons from total cultural and political annihilation.
Section 4. King Alfred's brilliant rebrand.
So, the crucial point is, winning the war was one thing, but Alfred now faced a massive problem. How do you unite the surviving, deeply fragmented peoples into a single, loyal force to keep the Vikings at bay? Instead of just ruling as the King of Wessex, he deliberately promoted a very specific term, Anglo-Sin, an Old English word meaning English folk, or kin of the Angles. Now remember, Alfred was a Saxon, but he realized that if they were going to survive the ongoing Viking threat, they couldn't be divided as Angles and Saxons anymore. They had to be one Angleson, fighting a common enemy.
But wait, why choose the Angles to name this new identity? Why not call it Saxon? Well, this is where Alfred's absolute political genius shines. Alfred had just taken control of the western half of Mercia, a kingdom that was historically founded by the Angles. If Alfred, a West Saxon, heavily pushed a Saxon supremacy narrative, the Anglian Mercians might have felt alienated, rebelled, and completely fractured their fragile alliance. So, by actively promoting an English identity, he flattered the Angles, making them feel like the core of the culture, and thereby locked in their loyalty to his Saxon throne.
And this brilliantly illustrates that Alfred didn't just use a clever word. Actually, scratch that. He engineered an entire culture. He rolled out a three-part unification strategy. First, he aggressively promoted literacy, specifically standardizing the West Sussex dialect of English. Second, he commissioned the translation of major Latin literary works into this English, giving the people a shared cultural pride. And third, he established the Doom Book, which sounds intense, but it was a single, unified code of law for all his subjects, regardless of what tribe they originally belonged to. One language, one literature, one law.
This strategic rebranding worked so perfectly that Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, was able to take it right to the finish line. In 927 AD, after finally conquering the Viking-held territory of Northumbria, Athelstan didn't just call himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, no, he officially took the title King of the English. By the late 10th century, you have chroniclers like Aethelward openly writing, Britannia is now called Anglia, taking the name of the victors. The rebrand was 100% complete.
Section 5. The Birth of England.
Let's move to our final chapter to explore how this incredibly successful political PR campaign left a permanent legacy on the world map. The most astonishing thing about the England identity is that it became so resilient it actually absorbed its later conquerors. Seriously. When the Danish king Canute conquered the territory in 1016, he didn't rename it. He proudly styled himself the king of all English lands. And when the Normans invaded from France in 1066, bringing entirely new systems of government, the name and identity of England held completely firm. The conquerors eventually became English, rather than the English becoming Norman. It's wild when you think about it.
Let's see how this builds into something that explains a modern geographic distinction that still confuses millions of people today. England is the specific country formed by the unification of those Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Great Britain is the geographical name of the entire island itself, which includes England, Scotland, and Wales. And the United Kingdom is the modern sovereign political state that encompasses Great Britain plus Northern Ireland. So the naming conventions we use today are quite literally a direct echo of King Alfred's strategic choices over a millennium ago. We're going to end our explainer today with a massive, provocative what if. What if Alfred the Great had lost the Battle of Edington? What if the Vikings had completely overrun Wessex, and the political necessity to invent a unified Angleson had just never happened? It is entirely possible that this island would have remained a fractured collection of smaller states forever, or maybe just become an extension of Scandinavia. It really goes to show how a single brilliant political rebrand by a king backed into a corner ended up permanently altering the course of global history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the words we use every single day.